This is the first in a series where I'm going to take a closer look at some movies that are divisive for the viewing audience. We often find ourselves prisoners of the moment, and when a movie's released, we praise it or condemn it almost instantly and rarely return to give it a second chance. Or we blindly praise it saying it's the best ever. This is all the more true with superhero movies, which for many of us hold a special place in our hearts. Today we're going to take a look at Spider-Man Homecoming and objectively decide whether it is underrated or overrated. By early 2015, Sony had released 5 Spider-Man movies, one of which is considered by many to be the greatest comic book movie of all time. However, as time moved on, the quality of the Spider-Man brand had diminished, especially when compared to the mammoth that is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So when leaked emails revealed that Sony and Marvel were negotiating on bringing the web-slinger into the MCU, fans were understandably excited. And even though the talks initially fizzled out, the groundswell of fan support eventually pushed the partnership through, with Spider-Man literally swinging into battle during the events of Captain America: Civil War. The unveiling of Peter Parker in the MCU left fans with literal tears in their eyes, and the webhead was quickly given his own movie under the umbrella of the MCU. That movie would eventually be known as Spider-Man Homecoming and began filming in 2016 and released on July 7, 2017. The film, which was directed by John Watts, picked up some big names for the cast, like Tom Holland, Zendaya, Michael Keaton, Marissa Tomei, Donald Glover, and to the glee of many, Robert Downey Jr. The movie was obviously a critical success and grossed over $900 million theatrically. Before we talk about whether or not the movie is underrated or overrated, let's give a quick rundown of the plot. Oh, and I should probably mention that while we probably could do this spoiler-free, it's probably more beneficial to do this with spoilers, so consider this your warning. The film opens up following the events that took place in the first Avengers movie. Adrian Toomes, played by Michael Keaton, is the owner of a salvage company who's hired to clean up the city, but is quickly halted by the Department of Damage Control, as per Tony Stark. Toomes, who already has his gear on site, tells his guys to keep some of the fallen Chitauri technology that they've already collected and to use the items to create weapons. We cut to Peter Parker, played by Tom Holland, whose personal vlog we see guide us through the events of Civil War along with Tony Stark. Tony tells Peter that he isn't ready to be an Avenger yet, but he can still keep the suit and encourages the young hero to be more of a street-level crime fighter. This is a theme that carries over through most of the film as Tony checks in on Parker periodically through his personal assistant, Happy Hogan. During this time, we also meet Peter's Aunt May, played by Marissa Tomei, who has no idea of Peter's alter ego. After encountering some goons who are using Chitauri weapons, Parker focuses on taking down the dealers of the arms. He eventually finds Toomes' goons, that's a tongue twister, one of which is a subtle version of Spider-Man rogue Herman Schultz, better known as the Shocker, and attempts to chase him down. Spider-Man isn't successful and nearly drowns after getting caught in his suit's parachute following being thrown into a lake. Iron Man comes to his rescue and we learn that Stark has lined the suit with additional technology, some of which allows for him to be tracked. Tony gives Peter a lecture and warns him not to get involved in any more high-level crime activity. Peter and the audience both learn in that moment that although Iron Man's suit is there talking to the disheveled Parker, Stark is actually at a party and the suit is just a shell. Around this time in the movie, we also get a more in-depth look at Toomes' operation and specifically the gear that allows him to become the Vulture. We learn that Toomes and his men are making money hand over fist in the weapons game and have managed to stay under the radar by only making money from the alien tech and not trying to rule the world with it. We cut back to Peter, who we learn has taken some Chitauri tech and is analyzing it when the Shocker comes in looking for the weapon. Parker is just able to hide both himself and the tech, but places a tracker on the goon, moving the plot forward for the second half of the movie. After working with his buddy Ned, Peter's able to see that the Shocker went to Washington, D.C., a place that he can conveniently go as a part of his school's academic decathlon team. Peter left that team earlier in the movie to focus on heroing full-time. And as a side note, Peter's love interest in the film, Liz Allen, is also part of the team, and the two characters' paths are intertwined in this story. After disabling Tony Stark's suit tracker, Peter and his buddy Ned also unlock a ton of DLC content for the suit, a running side gag for the rest of the film. Peter, with his own version of Jarvis, attempts to stop the Vulture from stealing Chitauri weapons from a truck, but is stuck inside both the truck and a large facility after the Vulture is able to phase out of the vehicle. While stuck in the secure building, Peter learns that the Chitauri tech that he gave Ned to safeguard is actually a ticking time bomb. Though Peter is able to escape the building, he isn't able to reach his team in time to stop the bomb, and it explodes as his classmates are visiting the Washington Monument. Although he is successful, Peter is barely able to make it to the top of the structure, however, and is able to save them all from a damaged elevator, including his crush, Liz. Following the incident in DC, Peter goes back to New York and shakes down a weapons buyer, and finds out that the dealers are going to be on the Staten Island ferry. After Spider-Man bumbles in an ongoing FBI investigation, the ferry is accidentally split in half by a malfunctioning Chitauri weapon. Spider-Man does his best to keep the boat together, but is ultimately unsuccessful, and hundreds of passengers look as if they're going to go down with the ship, only to be saved by Iron Man. It's here in the film that we learn that Peter felt that he needed to do this without Tony's help, because up to this point he had been ignored by Tony, saying, "If you even cared, you'd actually be here." Tony lays into Peter, telling him that he set up the investigation with the FBI following all the tips he received from Peter, and that he wanted Peter to be a better version of himself. Tony takes the suit back and does his best Uncle Ben impression when he says, "If you're nothing without the suit, then you shouldn't have it." Some time passes and Peter assimilates back into civilian life and works up the courage to ask Liz to homecoming. She agrees and everything looks to be on the up and up for the now restored friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. When Peter goes to pick up Liz, however, he's met at the door by Adrian Toomes, who we then learn is actually Liz's father. The revelation shakes Peter to his core as we come face to face with a man who he knows to be the Vulture, and who doesn't know that he's Spider-Man. Peter sweats bullets as Toomes takes the duo to the homecoming dance, and Toomes quickly deduces that Peter is actually Spider-Man. The Vulture appreciates that Peter saved his daughter's life at the Washington Monument and gives him a pass this time, but threatens to kill him if he interferes with his business again. When he eventually makes his way into the dance, Peter figures out that Toomes has a plan to intercept an Avengers jet that is transporting assets from their New York location to their upstate Avengers headquarters, a transition that has been alluded to the entire film by Happy Hogan. In his original homemade costume, Peter goes to the Vulture's hideout and is ambushed and nearly killed. He eventually makes his way out and intercepts the plane, eventually steering it to crash on a beach in Brooklyn. The Vulture and Spider-Man continue to fight on the ground until Toomes is almost killed by an explosion that Peter saves him from. Hogan and the authorities find the wreckage as Spider-Man watches from the top of the Coney Island cyclone. Following the crash, Parker turns down both an invitation to the Avengers as well as access to the Iron Spider costume. He instead decides to return to fighting crime on a street level, with Tony giving him back the original Stark Tech suit as a sign of respect for his heroic actions. The film ends with Aunt May catching Peter putting on the Spider-Man suit before the credits roll. So is it underrated? Well, let's think about this. Spider-Man finished 6th for the year of 2017, and 3 of the movies in front of it were superhero movies. Thor Ragnarok, Guardians of the Galaxy 2, and Wonder Woman all respectively performed better than the newest addition to the MCU. But to be fair, all 3 of those movies that I mentioned had fewer threats opening weekend than Spider-Man had. And money aside, there are understated aspects of the film that deserve to be mentioned. First, let's talk about the Vulture. The characterization of the Vulture is played perfectly by Michael Keaton, who chews up about every scene that he's in. You know, in a film universe that features villains like Ronan the Destroyer and Loki, it's nice to see a villain who balances out the main character. Spider-Man's a kid who happens to get superpowers and wants to help people out, and the Vulture's a guy who just happens to come across a way to feed families of both himself and his crew of workers, and just so happens to be screwed out of a major contract. The Vulture has no delusions of grandeur, he doesn't want to take over the world, he isn't hell-bent on destruction, he's just a guy who wants to make a living for himself and others. It's very relatable for the audience. Sure, he accidentally kills a guy and deals out weapons, but Toomes isn't really a horrible guy. He lets Peter go free despite having him dead to rights in his car, and the Vulture's show of mercy is a far cry from other bad guys in the MCU. And despite his low-key portrayal on screen, the Vulture just may be the best villain in the universe. The next good thing has to be Tom Holland, who absolutely slays as Peter Parker. You know, maybe it's because he actually looks like a kid, or the fact that his voice will crack at any second, but you know, whatever it is, Holland is the best part about this movie. And unlike prior screen portrayals of Spidey, Holland was able to pull off both an effective Peter Parker and Spider-Man, which was a concern going into the film. In previous iterations, we've had one or the other, but this one really seemed to nail it. His understated awkwardness plays well on screen, and also his genuine look of awe in the face of so many extraordinary situations. In fact, if you took out all the sci-fi elements of this movie and just played it through, it'd still play like a great high school comedy. The superhero aspect of Spider-Man takes a backseat to many of the running gags and entertainment that comes from just Peter and Ned's doing kid things, something we never saw in any other movie. And finally, despite a bit of backlash, it's probably also important to note here that the inclusion of a cast of diversity was probably a good choice based on where the movie's located, if nothing else. Personally, I'm all about representing the actual population of the location where a film takes place. This is New York that we're talking about, and if you've ever been to New York, it is a completely diverse location. It not only adds to the story, but also the credibility of the storytelling. The racial swap of established characters like Flash, Mary Jane, Shocker, and Liz all make sense if you've ever walked through most of the parts where the story takes place. NYC is one of the most diverse places on Earth, and the amazing cast reflects that. I didn't even realize this was a problem until I read reviews after seeing the movie. So the other question, is it overrated? Well, like I said before, we're all prisoners of the moment. Case in point, go back and read reviews of the Avengers when it first came out versus retrospective reviews. The truth is, even though Marvel put out 2 more movies after this before 2017 was over, Spider-Man Homecoming was still fresh enough that we can have a bit of recency bias. The film, while great, had problems, and they were problems we were willing to ignore because after all, this was Spider-Man's Homecoming. But when figuring out whether that 92% on Rotten Tomatoes is warranted, we have to be critical. First, let's talk about an omission in this film, which is the complete lack of Spidey senses. Sure, Parker had a great suit, more on that later, but he's able to react to foes so fast due to his enhanced senses firing off like an alarm. There isn't even a subtle reference to the idea of Spidey senses in this movie, which seems like a big miss considering that one of the underlying themes of the film was that Peter was a hero without this suit. Maybe the director felt that including this additional power wasn't necessary, just as the backstory wasn't necessary of how he got the powers. In either case, having spider senses done right in this film could have really elevated some of the scenes outside of the suit. And speaking of the suit, let's talk about it. Yes, the suit, it looked awesome, but throughout the film, it made Spider-Man OP. Peter Parker's spider ability along with his genius intellect are the two things that have always separated him from other heroes. Instead of accentuating those points about the web slinger, we instead get a suit that is so decked out in Stark Tech that it takes away from the rest of the film. There's no real danger presented in the film because we know that Stark Tech is going to save him. Whether it's Iron Man's suit flying in or the Karen AI literally walking him through how to be a hero, it's just too much. I'm down for Spider-Man having some gadgets. I think that in 2017 Spider-Man needs to have gadgets, but let's remember that this kid is a genius who should be able to develop some Goonie style devices that can help him on street level things. The entire advanced suit mode made Spider-Man feel more like Iron Man Light than Spider-Man Homecoming. And I know that the suit being so cool was a vehicle for him to save the day suitless, but even still, with all that stuff they showed in this movie, what's even left for the Iron Spider suit moving forward? Maybe you know if you've seen the Infinity War trailer, but I have sworn off trailers, so I can't really speak to that at this point. I think the final point is that Guardians of the Galaxy worked really well. The original movie worked really well because it was different than all the other Marvel films up to that point. Spider-Man had that same opportunity, especially when we were introduced to the film with an orchestra playing the classic Spider-Man theme. What we got instead was another paint-by-numbers Marvel movie featuring Spider-Man and his partner Tony Stark. Rather than branch out and develop its own ideas in the superhero genre, Homecoming relies on the same tropes as all the other MCU films. We have the same action, comedy, cinematography, and score that every other Marvel movie has, which kind of makes it bleed into the other films, especially when we see him on screen with Tony Stark. This is especially true the second half of the movie, where the pacing is ramped up and the character development that we saw in the first half is halted. Granted, there are some moments in the movie that feel fresh, like when Peter has nothing to shoot his webs onto in the suburbs, but for the most part, this is an MCU film, not a standalone film that happens to be in the MCU, like the first Guardians of the Galaxy. So is this movie underrated or overrated? Well, no matter what, people are going to be mad at the choice. So I have to rule that this is a very good movie, but it's still a bit overrated. Now, before the pitchforks come out, keep in mind that just because something is overrated doesn't mean that it's actually a trash bag. The numbers point to this film being an A+ outing for the folks at Sony and Marvel, but I'm more inclined to say it's an A-. To me, it's a fun movie that is certainly enjoyable to watch a few times over, but overall, it doesn't do enough unique things and spends too much time on the suit rather than Peter actually being a hero. What do you think about this movie? Is it underrated? Is it overrated? Is it just right? Let me know in the comments, and if there's a film that you'd like me to break down, let me know. Moving forward, I think the next video I'm going to do is going to be on Black Panther, just because there was so much hype surrounding it. If you have any additional suggestions, obviously let me know. But other than that, subscribe to the channel, tell people about it. If you like this video, hit the like button, and look for more in the future. Thanks for watching.